writing. And in fact, she wrote of herself that stuck at Everest Base Camp in Tibet for 5 days with an illness, I ran out of reading material. And I was reduced to reading the care labels on my equipment. We've all been there. Just very briefly, her career has been in South African publishing industry. She was the managing director at Oxford University Press, Southern Africa, for 12 years, and then found that unfortunately they weren't publishing the kind of books that she wanted to read. And since then she's run her own business as an international publishing consultant and a trainer in publishing. Kate is also an avid, not only reader, but hiker, a mountaineer, in fact. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome this reader, this mountaineer who's been all over the world, not only hiking herself, but leading other travels. Clearly, we have an adventure in our midst. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much. You have no idea how expensive it was to organize this Rent-A-Crowd. Cost me more than my fee. Anyway, welcome back to those of you who were here at winter school, and welcome to the other half who've come today. I'm going to start with just 2 slides that I showed at winter school explaining something about the criteria. The books that I've chosen are books that I've personally enjoyed. There are no recently published or heavily hyped books that most readers are likely to have read, including South African. So I excluded most South African books and recent bestsellers. And a lot of the books that I really love, like Margaret Atwood and Peter Carey, I've had to leave out because they're very well known. So it's not a best of list, but it attempts to introduce a South African reader to excellent little known books. Where did I find them? Well, since the age of 13, I've kept a list of everything I've read. And before you think that I'm completely anal obsessive, I have to say that we had to do this at school, which was collegiate, and so for 5 years there is my exercise book in which I recorded what I was reading. It's quite interesting to go back and just see how indiscriminate it was. And it was just a habit that was so useful that I've continued it to this day. So there's an extract from my current one, where I was also, just out of interest, marking ebooks, because I was interested to see what percentage of my reading constituted ebooks. And I'm very pleased to say in the publishing world, the turnover from ebooks has stabilized at about 30% of total turnover for books. And mainly in the genres of science fiction, romance, and detective stories, where most of the sales are. Okay. Today we're covering biography, autobiography, and memoir. On Wednesday, Joe Tyrrell is going to be doing travel and exploration. Tomorrow I'm doing history, archaeology, anthropology, one of each, and letters. Thursday is non-fiction, and Friday is fiction, and I've tried to choose fiction from around the world because one of the requests last year was for excellent books that have been published in other languages and translated into English. So the first one I'm starting with is Anthony Woodward's The Garden in the Clouds. This book won the National Trust Outdoor Book of the Year in 2011, and was picked as the Book of the Year in 2010 by The Times and The Spectator. He also wrote a book called Propellerhead, which is just as good as this one. And Propellerhead is about his love affair with flight. Now, he is completely obsessive, totally competitive, and very funny about it. So when he buys a small holding up in the Welsh mountains, in the clouds, and it's really just a farm or a small holding. He decides, very competitively, that he wants to get into the Open Gardens Yellow Book in England, and he wants to do it in a year. And this is partly about how he goes about doing this. He decides to market himself, or market the garden as the highest garden in England and Wales, and also about other things, about loss, about grief. He tries beekeeping along the way. He gets a bee in his bonnet about having an old railway carriage in his garden that he can use as a sort of writing shed. And it's just unbelievable to get a 20-foot railway carriage up this narrow mountain road, breaking his neighbour's 100-year-old stone-laid walls in the process. He has to make all of this good again, simply to have it. This actually is the garden in the clouds. He gets into the book, and he describes the getting past the notoriously fastidious county organiser, because the National Garden Scheme has a county organiser in each county, and she's a bit of a dragon. And he's deeply uncertain whether his not garden, N-O-T, and the ancient discarded farming implements artistically draped along the top of the stone wall are actually going to get past her. So he says, as I read on about the history of the scheme, a picture began to emerge of a type. Most were women with names like Daphne or Phillida or Veronica, who soon became the grand dames of the gardening world. The county organiser tended to be someone who'd grown up within and now kept a large walled garden. She was the kind whose obituary, and county organisers, it became clear, were the kind of people who got obituaries, said things like, could be impatient, had a knack for engineering spectacular fallings out, a process she thoroughly enjoyed. She needed no reassurance about her place in the world and had little time to spend reassuring those who did. As virtues, energy, efficiency, and effectiveness took precedence over charm and humour. As a result, county organisers were entirely immune to the latter. But in an imperial ancien regime way, she got things done. She was, in fact, my mother. And he goes on to describe the marble-eyed Welsh sheep who have a level of low cunning known to no other species. They jump walls, they eat hay, straw, silage, horse and cattle feed, chicken feed, bird seed, cat food, grass cuttings. They even eat, on a none the worse for eating, ivy and, incredibly, yew. There is his railway carriage, got at immense expense and cost up the mountain. These are the abandoned farming implements. Sorry. And anyway, the garden got in the National Garden Scheme and actually opened, and of course all his neighbours came to see what he'd done. And one of them said to him, "You've got a cheek to charge for this." Second one is also a memoir from England and from the countryside. It's James Rebank's The Shepherd's Life, which was published in 2015, and it became a bestseller in England. It was one of those books that spread by word of mouth. It's fantastic. This is the real deal. This is a man who grew up, I think there are 500 years of his ancestors have farmed sheep in the mountains of the Lake District. And it's just bred in his bones. It's exactly what he's always wanted to do. It's a passionate memoir, and I think it's going to become a classic of social history. He's a very unusual hill farmer. He has an unmistakable anger at the school system, which was very indifferent, which denigrated his choice of life as a shepherd. They treated rural people as ignorant. Shepherding is an unambitious career choice. And the Lake District seems to exist for the benefit of tourists who drive up, and incomers who drive up house prices and have no appreciation of the traditional farming that has gone on there for so many years. He calls it a classic case of cultural imperialism. He leaves school at the age of 15 because all he wants to do is go farming. And the main part of the book is really the business of shepherding his flock of sturdy Herdwick sheep. These are them in the photographs, and it gives you some idea of the mountainous country. And he talks about the business of sheep rearing. It's not just rearing, selling, and buying lambs at the right price, which is crucial to economic survival, but it's also about your reputation for fairness, for honesty within the community. And it's the work that dominates the gathering and herding, the clipping, the dosing with antibiotics, feeding, castrating, burning carcasses after the culling decreed during the foot and mouth epidemic. And the work is closely intertwined with the characters and relationships of the farming families. He brings his grandfather's beloved sheepdog Ben to the bedside after the older man has suffered a stroke. He's so skilled that he's actually an inspector and a breeder of Herdwick tups, or rams. He shows wit, likening the shearing of ewes' tails so that rams can mount them more easily as removing the woolly knickers. Tup fever, as Rebank's mother calls it, accounts for luminous sections of the story. Farmers pore over flock books and pedigrees all winter on dark nights, looking for the perfect specimen. Rebank says, I'm looking for practical things like size, alertness, mobility. But because sheep are cultural objects, almost like art, I'm looking for style and character as well, and finer breed points, like how white their ears are. I know what the perfect Herdwick tup looks like because it struts around in my head. And when he sells a particular star, Rebanks misses him for weeks. He says, as if I once had a Van Gogh on my wall and now it is gone. Horatio Clear said in a review, it's impossible not to take to a man who says, if I only had a few days left on earth, I would spend one of them inspecting Herdwick tups. We also learn something of his personal life, the painful intergeneral conflict with his father, his meeting of his rock-like wife-to-be, Helen, and his astonishing return to the education system in his 20s. He goes to Oxford. He's got no O-levels or A-levels, and he gets a double first in history. But because hill farming no longer pays enough of an income for a family to live on it, he has a second job advising UNESCO on small-scale farming around the world. That brings in the income, but he has absolutely no thought of giving up farming. Tom Fort wrote, it's an exceptional book. His way with words is akin to that of an expert shearer with the clippers, swift, deft, skilled, and the resulting prose is lean, vivid, tough, and handsome. I loved this book. It's one to restore faith in writing, a story not like any other, told from the inside by someone whose passion for his subject lights up almost every sentence. I loved it too, and I have no intention of going sheep farming. Some of you may know of Diana Athill, who has written a number of books. And I chose to start with the one that really made her name, called Stet. And stet is a proofreader's mark, ... under what you've crossed out, and you write stet in the margin, or you do a little tick with a circle in it. And this is a photograph of, Diana in her young days when she was first in publishing and as she is now. I think she's about 98 now. And a couple of years ago, she won the Telegraph's Best Dressed Woman Award. One of the best dressed over 50s. Sorry, it was The Guardian. She's very striking. She was brought up as landed gentry, but she says she was a sucker for oppressed foreigners. An inclination she described as a funny kink in her maternal instinct. I never particularly wanted children, but came out in liking lame ducks. One lover, the Egyptian author Wagu Gali, a depressive, committed suicide in her flat. And her most remarkable affair, about which she later wrote a book, was a fleeting and distinctly odd relationship with Hakim Jamal, an American black radical who asserted that he was God and a cousin of Malcolm X. Her longest relationship was with the Jamaican playwright Barry Record. The affair lasted 8 years, but he shared her flat for 40. She described it as a detached sort of marriage in which a much younger lover of his moved in and became good friends with Diana. In fact, they went on to have children, and Diana sort of acted as an aunt come grandmother come godparent to the children, and even after Barry moved out, she remained exceptionally close to his lover. She's funny, acute, and wise, and she writes with remarkable candour and simplicity, as if she was musing aloud to the reader. In 2008, she won the Costa Book Award for her memoir Somewhere Towards the End. It's a book about old age. And also received the National Book Critics Circle Award. All her books are worth reading, but I'm going to concentrate on Stet. Instead of a letter, was actually the one of her upbringing. She went to work for Andre Deutsch. These are her other books, some of her other books. And Andre Deutsch, I don't know if you can read the lettering at the back, but this is Andre Deutsch. He was a legendary publisher. He emerges in the book as a determined, bold, irascible, often insufferable, and highly charismatic figure. But it's also a chronicle of a long-vanished age of publishing before the corporates took over, when it was still possible to run a company from one rented room with your ideals of literary quality intact. It's sad, she says, to think that we did not appreciate the luxury of not having to ask ourselves, is it commercially viable, in those happy days before the questions set in. And despite being a director of the company, she prides herself on having no interest or involvement in the financial side. I still can't quite believe it. Anyway, but she was only interested in the quality of the books they published. Through all the vicissitudes of trying to keep the company afloat while fending off creditors and the injudged and often incapable assortment of people that Deutsch employed, they actually built a remarkable list of authors. Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, John Updike, Mordecai Richler, Simone de Beauvoir, V.S. Naipaul, and Jean Rice, among others. Can you see the lettering on the... Okay. It's an unflattering portrait of V.S. Naipaul, which drew a lot of publicity when the book came out. She writes, "Whenever I needed to cheer myself up by counting my blessings, I used to tell myself, at least I'm not married to Vidya." And i.e. Nepal. She notes that Sonia All was an intellectual snob without having, as far as I could see, a good enough mind to justify it. Of the 60s, she remarks, "Most of the people I knew had been bedding each other for years without calling it a sexual revolution." But in the chapters on her authors that she found and that she developed, particularly the brilliant, pitiful Jean Rice, there's real tenderness and affection. Timothy Moe said of Diana Athill, she doesn't write well, she writes wonderfully well, rather better than most of her writers. She's still alive, as I said, 98, and still writing. The BBC featured her in a programme called Growing Old Disgracefully. She's completely irreverent, and her books are real page-turners. Highly recommended if you haven't come across them. Another older woman who broke the mould is Jane Juska in her book A Round-Heeled Woman. This is Jane Juska on the left, and her book was made into a play. This is the actress Sharon Gless with Jane Juska. And Sharon Gless played Jane Juska. For those of you who don't know, and I've done a bit of research, and a lot of people actually don't know this, a round-heeled woman, the term, was once slang for a prostitute. And these days it just means a woman who likes a lot of sex and spends a lot of time on her back. Now, Juska is a semi-retired English teacher with refined tastes. She likes Trollope novels, opera and museums. And the starting point for this book was an ad that she placed in the New York Review of Books in the personals column, which read, "Before I turn 67 next March, I would like to have a lot of sex with a man I like. If you want to talk first, Trollope does it for me." While her adventures meeting these men frame her narrative, she's no geriatric Emmanuel on a coast-to-coast fling. It's just that she was raised by repressed Midwesterners and had never managed, given her spiritual and physical bulk in those years, a truly fulfilling love affair. Married to a loveless man, then divorced, celibate for 30 years, estranged for a while from her son, she admits to feelings of loneliness and emptiness that her passion for English literature can no longer assuage. By the time she emerged from her chrysalis, she realized she'd never had a chance at pleasure, hence her ad and the comic adventures with an assortment of men culled from the 63 responses. She took a sabbatical from teaching just to have time to respond and meet some of the men. She writes, "Over the coming weeks, I received 63 replies, which I divided into yes, no, and maybe." So she goes to meet the men, much to the shock and amazement of her female friends, and navigates her way through rednecks, perverts, total losers, and the occasional decent chap with admirable dignity. She has a lot of sex, at least some of which is good. Perhaps equally importantly, she makes friends and she fills a void in her life. And then I'm reading a section of the book. She meets a very nice man and they are reciting the names of authors to one another in sort of mounting excitement. Completely turned on by literature. And then she writes, "We collapsed in a mutual orgasm on the last syllable. In the morning, John is dressed early. I don't mean to rush you," he says, "but I have an appointment." "What could be more important than me?" I ask. I'm bold with bitterness. "A CAT scan," he says. "The doctor wants to find out if my liver has cancer." "Have you had symptoms?" "Yes." "Will you let me know?" "No." Perils of senior romance. While it's no surprise that the best man comes last and that he's a hunk much younger than her with a brilliant mind, it's not actually the most memorable thing about this quirky little memoir. Surprisingly, it's Juska's accounts of visiting the Berg collection at the New York Public Library, the story of the writing classes in prison that she teaches. And there's something universal in her love affair with the written word and her courage in tackling the taboo subject of sexual desire in older people. You all know about that, right? She comes across as a brave and notably honest woman, refusing to surrender to the dying of the light. And this result is an engaging, funny, and utterly frank account of her experiences. It was turned into a play. It was also a bestseller, and these are some of the scenes from the play. I'm waiting for them to make a film of it. The next one on my list is Slavomir Ravik's The Long Walk. So we go from one form of deprivation to another. This is a book that I first encountered as a teenager, and I must have read it 4 or 5 times. So mesmerized was I by it. I still am. It's a classic escape and survival tale. In the early 50s, Slavomir met a journalist, Ronald Downing, who's shown on the left, and so taken was he with the story of Slav's escape from a Siberian labor camp in 1941 that he persuaded him to write about his experiences. It sold more than 500,000 copies and been translated into 25 languages and made into a film by Peter Weir called The Way Back. It's a story of a Polish officer, a good and gentle man caught up in the savageries that followed Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, when that country was partitioned between the Nazis and the Soviet Union. Slav's account started in the notorious Lubyanka prison in Moscow, as he was sentenced to 25 years hard labor for spying after 12 months of interrogation. Dispatched to Siberia, he and thousands of others were transported in open cattle trucks, sub-zero temperatures, to the end of the line at Irkutsk, where, chained together, they were force-marched hundreds of miles to Camp 303, which the survivors had to build from scratch. You can see the first part of the march to the Gulag. In April 1941, with the aid of the camp commandant's wife, Slav and 6 others escaped in a blizzard. Over the next 18 months, they walked 6,500 kilometers south, living off the land. To reach British India, under-provisioned and with hardly any equipment except their worn camp clothes, they crossed the dense Siberian taiga in deep snow during one of the coldest recorded winters in history, past Lake Baikal, continued through Mongolia, suffering extreme heat in the Gobi Desert, before they made it to Tibet. Once on the plateau, they crossed over the Himalayas into British India, where they were found and rescued by a Gurkha patrol. Sheer determination had overcome bitter cold, suffocating heat, thirst, starvation, and injury. 3 of the 7 died on the way. By the end of his ordeal, Slav weighed 5 stone. After a period in hospital, the 4 dispersed, never to meet again, and Slav never did recover his full health. It's a stunning and compelling tale, which remains a classic of escape and survival. But there's still controversy today over the authenticity of the story, whether it really happened, and if so, by whom. Slav was unable to prove that he had done this. I mean, they had no cameras, they had no records of any kind. There's evidence both for and against the authenticity of the story. Another Pole, Witold Glinski, claimed that it was based on his story. And an American researcher and traveller, Linda Willis, became fascinated by the story and researched every aspect of it. And she wrote a book called Looking for Mr. Smith, who was the American who was part of the party. And she tries to find out who he actually is. That's the manuscript. It's an actual photo of a Siberian gulag. And these are scenes from the film by Peter Weir, The Long Way Back. I think it had Brad Pitt looking indecently healthy in it. My next book is a different kind of journey, and this time it's a psychological journey from one's roots. This is The Calling of Kate McCallum by Margaret McCord. It won the Sunday Times Alan Paton Prize when it came out, and it's a moving and illuminating memoir that illustrates the life of an extraordinary woman in South Africa who was born in 1873 in colonial South Africa and lived through the early days of apartheid until her death in 1955. She had a remarkable life. In her mid-teens, she and her elder sister joined a local choir, which became noted for its singing and eventually became the African Native Choir, which performed in front of Queen Victoria in 1891. Her sister was the first South African black woman to attain a BA, so it was a family of remarkable women. Although she was offered a career as an international opera singer, Kate McCallum felt that home and family were more important to her than travelling around the world. These are photographs that were on display at the National Gallery. A very beautiful woman at the top is Eleanor Cloniwe. And in the morning, they performed in African dress, singing African songs and gospel songs. And after lunch, they performed in a Victorian dress, singing Western music. And these are the two photographs of both of them. So Kate McCallum came back to South Africa, trained as a nurse, and moved to KwaZulu-Natal, where she raised a family and was the clinic assistant to a Dr. McCord, an American doctor who worked in KwaZulu-Natal. She never spoke about the early part of her life. Margaret McCord was the doctor's daughter, and it was only towards the end of Katie's life that she started asking her about it and discovered that she'd had this extraordinary first part. And so Margaret McCord taped her recall and wrote up the story. She had an innate sense of right and wrong, a sharp tongue, and a wholehearted love for both the people and the land of her country. She opens a window to a side of South African life seldom recorded, looking at South Africa's patriarchal culture, its customs, community traditions, poverty and hardships. It encompasses epoch-making events from the Boer War to the World Wars to the transition from colonialism to apartheid. She tells of her grandmother, injured by one of Shaka Zulu's warriors, of her mother, a school teacher converted to Christianity by missionaries, of her sister and of her own experiences, including her flight during the Boer War, the deaths of several of her children, her work at the Zulu Hospital in Durban, and her political activism. She successfully led the march against past laws for women. The book is as quietly powerful a memoir, told as unassumingly as Kate McCallum lived. It's highly recommended as a testament to one woman's character, intelligence, and faith. Next book I've chosen is by Lorna Sage, called Bad Blood, which was actually published in 2001. She grew up in Hanmer, a village on the Welsh border, where she lived first with her parents and then her grandparents in the vicarage, a filthy Gothic place that nobody cleaned. Her grandfather was the village vicar, but not the respectable kind. He was boozy and a serial womanizer. The old devil, his twisted, malicious wife called him. and not affectionately. Indulging in lust and drink, he becomes for his granddaughter a defiant and grandly outrageous figure in his self-defeating recklessness, a Gothic outsider with all the glamour of the undead. Sage found out when she wrote the book and her father handed over her grandfather's diaries that her grandmother had been blackmailing her husband, squirreling away his silence payments about his affairs into an account in their granddaughter's name. The book begins, "Grandfather's skirts would flap in the wind along the churchyard path, and I would hang on. He often found things to do in the vestry, excuses for getting out of the vicarage, and as long as he took me, he couldn't get up to much. I was a sort of hobble. He was my minder, and I was his. He would have liked to have got further away, but petrol was rationed. The church at least was safe. My grandmother never went near it except feet first in her coffin, but that was years later, when she was buried in the same grave as him. Rotting together for eternity, one flesh at last, after a lifetime's mutual loathing." Lorna Sage was considered by her family to have inherited much of her grandfather's bad blood, hence the title. But he did teach her to read, instilled in her a love of books, and unfortunately she bore out their predictions when she became pregnant at 16, still believing that she was a virgin. She had no idea, of sex. And so she and Victor, the child's father, had a daughter, Sharon. They wrote their A-levels together, and then both got firsts from Durham University. They went to college together and both joined the English department at the University of East Anglia. And the book ends with the Sages going off to Durham University, being thrown onto a different path away from the claustrophobia of this tiny village, Hanmer. The book made Lorna Sage, who was known in literary circles as a brilliant critic and professor of English, famous. It sold hundreds of thousands. It won rave reviews and the Whitbread Prize for Biography in 2001. It was a triumph, clouded by her death from emphysema a week later, at the age of 57. Highly recommended. Our next book is William Fine's The Music Room, because it provides such a contrast to Lorna Sage's account of a dysfunctional family. If hers was dysfunctional and Gothic, his was loving and compassionate and warm, sheltering the mentally ill son in the middle of it, who could be quite destructive. William Fine's first book, The Snow Geese, won numerous prizes, and his second book, The Music Room, is the story of growing up in an English castle, which remains unknown, but is actually well known. I looked it up. It's this one, Bruton Castle. He grew up alongside a brother, Richard, 11 years older, who suffers from severe epilepsy and brain damage. The Music Room has been called a small masterpiece, a tribute to the power of place, family, and memory. Sublimely evocative, and a beautiful and fortifying book, even a great one. It was shortlisted for 6 prizes. He spent his childhood in a magical place, a moated castle more than 700 years old, the perfect environment for a child with a brimming imagination. Richard's energy influences the rhythms of the family and the house's internal life. As one of the reviewers wrote, Richard is a wonderfully vivid character, by turns foolish, sweet, aggressive, confused, hopelessly irritating, yet possessed of an odd, gawky charm. He moves through the book like a force of nature, and sometimes, with some unexpected gesture or turn of phrase, filling the lives of those around him with a strange sort of magic. He says of his psychologist, "She's like red roses, shining in a way." Yet as charming, lyrical and childlike as he can be, he also comes across as something of a bull on his better days, and frighteningly aggressive or even dangerous and violent. He's a very sick young man, and as his illness progresses, he will have to endure encounters with the police, expulsion from the care centre, and an array of mind-altering drugs that, while they allow some control over his seizures, induce amnesiac fugues, extreme lethargy, and moments of heart-stopping carelessness. The music room defies categorization. It's part family romance, part historical investigation, but it is at its heart an inquiry into how fundamentally we're defined by the duties of care that we assume or inherit. Care of the land, care of a house, care of ourselves, or care of a difficult and sometimes dangerous son or brother. Fine's mother and father are the custodians not only of their children, but of an estate passed down through my father's ancestors since the 14th century. An estate which includes a moated castle and extensive parklands. The castle opens to the public and is a focal point for film shoots and local community events. The portrait of his parents is wonderful. They're patient, stoical, perplexed, quietly heroic. They get on with things, only rarely allowing their pain and bewilderment to show through. He writes, "One afternoon I saw Dad standing next to the house, his right arm stretched out, palm pressed flat against a buttress. His head dropped. He didn't move." "What are you doing?" I asked. He said he was asking the house for some of its strength. This scene comes after a particularly violent outburst during which Richard menaces his parents and brother with an iron bar and smashes kitchen windows. Later he'll sleep, still later he'll repent, but eventually he actually has to be institutionalized and eventually dies. Fine is an unusually skilled and thoughtful writer. His book is searing melancholy and quiet exuberance that are twined with scholarship in an elegant book written with infinite restraint that make the emotionally charged contents almost unbearably poignant. It's exquisite, highly recommended. From a functional family to a dysfunctional family, we have Augustine Burroughs running with scissors, which was a New York Times bestseller. He was born into a very unhappy and dysfunctional family. His father was distant and unappealing. He writes, he had psoriasis that covered his entire body and gave him the appearance of a dried mackerel that could stand upright and wear tweed. His mother was crazy. Gone were the days when she would stand on the deck lighting lemon-scented candles without then having to eat the wax. Unfortunately, my parents loathed each other and the life they had built together. Because I was the product of their genetic fusion, well, it's not surprising that I like to boil my change on the stove and then shine it with metal polish. His mother was a diva from Georgia, and she spent her time writing poetry, sending self-addressed envelopes to the New Yorker, and sitting around the house with shampoo devil horns while listening to Anne Sexton. She spent much of her time under the care of her psychiatrist, Dr. Finch. Then at the age of 12, the author found himself officially handed over to the psychiatrist's family to be brought up. His mother just gave him away. And she made the doctor her son's official guardian. And Augustine found himself moved into a household that was even nuttier than the one in which he'd started. Running with Scissors is a bawdy, outrageous, hilarious account of what Fiona Hook in the Times described as Adrian Mole scripted by Hieronymus Bosch. He writes of being sent